Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
Today we're going to be talking about a figure in African American history, and that is Marcus Garvey. And Chris, Marcus Garvey and the Garveyites, this is something, I teach every semester in American history too. One of the more fascinating aspects, I think, of history when we think about the history, of the early civil rights movement, not the 1960s and stuff, but the very early side of it.
Yeah, and once again, even when we're talking about the early side of this, there are a lot of names that come to mind, and there's a lot of different things that are going on. I always say name wrong, but W.E.B. Du Bois or Dubois, however you want to say it. You've got him.
Yep.
And he has a great speech. He's trying his best to do some things. But Marcus Garvey is one of those individuals who has a fascinating part in American history, and yet very few people do not know much about him unless they are into Rastafarianism. If they're into, Jamaica and, the relationship between Jamaica and America. And, they, besides Bob Marley, it's really Marcus Garvey who comes in and plays a pretty important role in just talking about, I guess, how not to do civil rights, if you will, because he kind of came in with a very strong, bold, determined way of doing things. And ultimately, it was rejected by just about anyone and everyone, including the people he was trying to help.
Yeah, he's one of these figures that is often sort of compared and contrast with your W.E.B. Du Bois's, your Martin Luther King's, and people like that. He's often contrasted with them because his solutions, of course, were very different than their solutions to the problems that African Americans were facing at this particular point in American history. So Marcus Garvey was born on August 17, 1887, in St. Anne's Bay, Jamaica. So he is from the island of Jamaica. His father was a stonemason and his mother was a domestic servant. So he grows up there in Jamaica, and he moves to London, where he studies there at the University of London. So this is a well-traveled, well-educated young man by the time he reaches his 20s. So this is someone who he knows what he's doing. He knows he's been around a little bit, both literally. When you think about you traveling to London and all that, he's been around a little bit. So he knows how to approach people. He knows he's been exposed to different types of thinking and different cultures, if we were.
Well, and one of the other things is, you're right, he moves to London and he's enrolled in a pretty prestigious university there, and he starts working for a newspaper. And it's there that he begins to become exposed to this idea of Pan-African nationalism. And Pan-African nationalism is basically an ideology that promotes unity among people of African descent.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to kind of go back and see where Marcus Garvey's roots are, because he even describes his father, who had a great influence on him. He said that his dad was, quote, severe, firm, determined, bold, strong, and he refused to yield even to superior forces if he believed that he was right. And that was his dad, but his genes kind of came into Marcus Garvey as well, because Marcus was that same way. He was stubborn in his beliefs. And you'd right, that whole idea of nationalism is something that we see all throughout American history. This pride in your culture, pride in your society, pride in your nation. And he had pride as a Black individual, and he thought that all of the individuals that were of African descent should be unified. And it's interesting because we talked about W.B. Du Bois, but there's another individual that kind of goes back and forth with W.B. Du Bois, and that was, Booker T. Washington.
Yep.
And one of the things, about Booker T. Washington is that, he had written a book, and in that book, he stated very strongly that Black individuals should be economically self-sufficient, and that they should establish an independent nation in Africa. Is kind of where Marcus Garvey goes with this. He takes what Booker T is saying and what W.B. Du Bois is saying and says, okay, well, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to call it Garveyism. I mean, Ray, I mean, when you come up with a plan, you might as well just name it your own. So he calls Garveyism, and that is what he said. He said that they should be self-sufficient, but not only self-sufficient, but that they needed to establish a nation in Africa. And that's what really starts rubbing people the wrong way, because they've worked hard for who they are and for what they've done and for where they've gone. And so that makes a huge difference in what they're trying to do in life.
Yeah, and one of the things when I look at Marcus Garvey and this pan Africanism is the idea of loss of culture. They're looking at, or Garvey's looking at, and others who ascribe to this view are looking at, you know, Africans losing their culture in the United States, Africans losing their culture in London. They're sort of being taken, they were taken out of Africa, and they're sort of assimilating into these other cultures and losing that African. I think that's a big part of what he is concerned about, getting that African culture back. All these people who were from Africa, or their descendants of people who were from Africa, and they're wanting to see that sort of rescue of their culture. But also they're looking at, especially, for example, in the United States, segregation, Jim Crow during this period, racism, lynching, and all this. They're looking at all this terrible stuff that's going on in the United States. And it's like, well, we can't depend on the white man to help us. We can't depend on the white man to suddenly become our friend. We've got to sort of, do it ourselves. And if that means, having our own businesses, having our own cruise line, having our own country in Africa, or countries in Africa where we can go to and sort of have our own nation, then that's what we're going to do. And I think that was his approach. Sort of surprised me to learn that Booker T. Washington was involved in the Pan-African movement. I was not aware of that until sort of working on this material. Because he was, because he was more of an accommodationist, and Garvey was not.
Oh, right. And I think the disconnect that comes with Garvey is that he had the right idea of promoting unity. That part is right. And maintaining the culture, because unfortunately, and this is where America really failed, is we claim that we have a melting pot, where you have all of these cultures that come and they get mixed into one culture, and we lose the flavor, if you will, of the African culture. We lose the flavor of the Italian culture. And so Garvey wanted to make sure that didn't happen. So rightfully so. I mean, that is really good. The problem is that he had given up on America. He had given up on liberty. He had given up on freedom. And and you and I, as two white history instructors, really can't begin to truly understand, what was going on with this. But if I kind of look at it through the historian eyes, I could see that culture said, wait a second, after all that our ancestors have done to try to make it in this new world, to try to make it in the United States, after all the oppression, all the persecution, all of the problems, you want us to go to Africa and to establish our own nation and to be unified over there? But we've worked hard, and our ancestors have worked hard to be unified in America. And so we don't think that the approach should be to leave. We agree with this whole nationalism, but we don't necessarily agree that we should leave where we've worked to try to be successful. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah, because the idea of sort of back to Africa, return to Africa, this was a very old idea, even by, when he starts really coming of age, and when Garvey starts really coming of age, and, having his moment to sort of explain his views and becoming influential, when he's in his 20s. the idea of, sort of returning or having blacks go back to Africa was something that, had been rejected long ago. I mean, that was something that was being advocated by guys like Thomas Jefferson. And of course, it was, I said, no, no, we built this country. We're as much American as anybody else. This is our home just as much as anybody else. You're not going to kick us out of here.
And he didn't,
But he wasn't
there's a
he
lot.
wasn't advocating. He wasn't Garvey was not advocating kicking themselves out. He was just advocating voluntarily moving.
Right. To go somewhere else and to establish it where it could be their own guidelines, their own places. And one of the things, I mean, he does do some good.
Yeah.
One of the things that he does is he establishes a shipping company that was called the Black Star Line, and that was designed to be a company that would establish trade and commerce between people of African descent, around the globe, and also would transport passengers back and forth to Africa. So he's trying to provide Black individuals jobs and an opportunity to be successful, and to have a good life. He also begins to establish companies that manufacture marketable commodities that would travel from the America to Africa as well. But in the back of his mind, he has a goal that everything that he does will promote, spread forth his idea of Garveyism. At the back of his mind, that's all he is trying to do. And there's a while that people are excited about him. I mean, at one time, some of these organizations and companies that he has like over 4 million people that are involved in his movement. And yet, he would always go and speak of, you need to have pride in your African history. You need to have pride in culture. This is where you have W.B. Du Bois, who comes in, and Ray, you have Du Bois, who says that Marcus Garvey is the most dangerous enemy of Black individuals in America. And there starts to be this really strong dislike between Du Bois, and Garvey, because that's when there's some strong insults that start being waged between the two, actually hurting the movement of both groups and what they're trying to do.
Absolutely. And that their visions were so different. That I think that's the core, that is the core of it. Their visions of what was good for African Americans. And of course, Du Bois is taking the position that I think historically had been the position, that is, this is our country. Why are we going to leave it? Why are you advocating we leave our country? One thing I did want to say, though, just talking about Garvey founding the Black Star Line, he was, just to show how determined he was and how capable he was. He started that business when he was 27 years old. And then 27 years old, I hadn't done anything productive.
Some people would say you and I are 50 years old, haven't done anything productive.
50 years old and still haven't done anything productive. But he was 27 years old. And here he is, this young man who has, very deep convictions on these matters. And he's putting his money and he's putting his resources and he's putting his effort and his time into, supporting what he believes. So many people, they have their ideas and all this, but they don't really do anything with it. They sort of sit on it. Marcus Garvey took those ideas and worked to actually see them through. Yes, he wanted African Americans to leave America and go to Africa and that kind of thing, and sort of self-segregation, I guess you could call it. Yes, he wanted that, but he was, I'm guessing going to say he's putting his money where his mouth was. He was putting legs to his ideas.
I can only imagine if Garvey would have kept the culture and kept that desire, but left out the part about this separatist philosophy.
Right.
And it would have joined with Du Bois, who was the co-founder of the NAACP.
Right.
Imagine, the the unity that would have, both of them wanted unity. Imagine the unity that would have been found there. But what happens is, and I'm not going to put it all on Garvey, but I think it basically all does go to Garvey, is that Garvey, because of this Garveyism, because of the separatist philosophy, it hurts what the African Americans were trying to do in America, because he becomes so intent on getting his way. Remember, his dad was strong, bold, determined,
Right.
fierce. He would do what he wanted to do, even if he knew he wasn't right. He was still going to make himself right. That you start to get people who have an interest in silencing Garvey because he's causing more problems than good. And Ray, the least of his problems was Du Bois, because very quickly Marcus Garvey is going to be known by someone who was very, very high up, and that was the director of the FBI, none other than J. Edgar Hoover.
And, one of the things when I was looking into this that was interesting to me is that basically, and Chris, you're, I think, a little bit more knowledgeable in this particular section of his life. But my understanding is that he gets involved trying to sell some stock for the Black Star Line, and that sort of fails. And there's accusations of fraud and irregularity. And that, of course, gets the attention of the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover. And ultimately, he is prosecuted. And Chris, there were some, of course, who claimed that was, and I'm sure this was Garvey's position, that that was a politically motivated thing. And you see even today with Martin Luther King, you see accusations about, not just accusations, there's some evidence to support it, that the CIA was monitoring him and all that.
Well, and J. Edgar Hoover, even in his writings, basically said, I want to go after this individual because what he is doing is he is inciting Black people across the country to stand up in a militant defiance, and he is an agitator. And so Hoover, who is well known for just trying to find information that is bad against people, he is like focused on him. This is kind of like before Martin Luther King, when Hoover and Martin Luther King had that tremendous disagreement. Hoover sets his sights on Garvey to the point where he actually hires the first Black FBI agent and gives the first assignment to that FBI agent to be one who infiltrates into Garvey's ranks and spies on him. And that's when they start finding out that, he's kind of, quote, cooking the books. And, there are so many irregularities in the books. And so, he is convicted, found guilty. They sentence him to 5 years in prison. That's bad. Garvey feels that it's racially motivated. He feels that J. Edgar Hoover is out just to get him. And so he appeals, and, that appeal is denied. And next thing you know is he's saying, I don't want to be in jail for 5 years. And so what he does is he asks for permission to leave the country and to go back to his homeland in Jamaica. And so he will serve 2 years and then is released from prison and deported to Jamaica. Now, you have to ask yourself, was it politically motivated? Was it racially motivated? Or was Marcus Garvey kind of caught up in his own power struggle to where all of this fighting, even among people who supported nationalism, if that didn't just raise, the antennas of other people?
And it was President Calvin Coolidge that actually commuted his sentence to time served, interestingly enough. So he is deported to Jamaica. And, so I guess the question you're asking, Chris, is, was Garvey a victim of his own actions, or was he a victim of other people's actions? And, when I look at Garvey, yes, I see some things where I say, yeah, if he hadn't gone, like you said earlier, if he hadn't gone to the back to Africa thing if he hadn't got on that. But I still see a lot in Garvey that's very commendable. Someone who's very dedicated to his belief. And I think at the end of the day, Chris, it was a good, Black people in the United States were facing very difficult situations and circumstances. Racism, Jim Crow, all of that was very much present. And pushing back against that was a good thing. But like we've already mentioned, W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King, and others had a different approach. And I think probably an approach that was more useful, more helpful than Garvey's approach. Because Garvey's approach was basically, well, we're just going to leave,
And I think that's where it ultimately comes back to. He goes back, and while he is in Jamaica, he will write books, and he will still kind of remain on the scene, but he's really not on the scene. He does most of his work from Jamaica. He eventually goes to London, but people really are not paying attention a lot to what he is doing. It is interesting that Marcus Garvey, his memory and his influence still remained. There were still some people who believed strongly in Garveyism because, they appreciated the fact of his pride in the African culture. They appreciated the fact that he wanted all individuals of African descent to be successful and to live and to be free. I remember he had a quote that basically said, if you have no confidence in yourself, you are twice defeated in the race of life. With confidence, you have won even before you have started. And so he really wanted the best for people, for his people, the people of his culture. And I have a lot of respect for individuals who have so much pride in their culture. We teach in the classrooms and we talk about this idea that as Americans, we should be thankful for the opportunity to be able to have the freedoms that are accorded to us, the freedom to disagree, the freedom to see things in different lights. I am constantly teaching students the importance of standing at attention when we say the Pledge of Allegiance or when the Star Spangled Banner is sung, as a reminder for those individuals who truly want to have pride in where they've been, where they've come from, and who they are. I think W.E.B. Du Bois felt that. I believe Booker T. Washington did that, along with all of the other people that we've talked about in history. But even Marcus Garvey, I think he just became misguided in thinking that it was not going to happen in America, so let's go somewhere else. I only wish that he would have teamed up with others, because you remember Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Despised one another for the longest time, because one wanted to go one direction, peaceful change, and the other wanted to do by any means necessary. But at the end of the day, they respected one another and they actually worked together, even though they had different opinions. I only wish that Marcus Garvey would have done that with Booker T and W.B. Du Bois, because I do think that maybe the struggles, it was very severe, but I wonder if the struggles could have been not as bad because you had three strong groups who were uniting. You leave Hoover out of it, you leave the FBI out of it, you leave all of those things out of it. Maybe it would have made a difference. I don't know. But it is interesting that, you and I, we were talking about wanting to do some things. Marcus Garvey has been on our mind for some time. And, we have made it to this episode in the podcast. And what's interesting is that Marcus Garvey's name came up in the national news not too long ago, which I think still speaks to the fact that people are still talking about Marcus Garvey.
Yeah, posthumously, President Joe Biden issued a full pardon for Marcus Garvey. Many years after he died in 1940. He had moved to London, where he was living permanently, and he had suffered a pretty major stroke, Chris. I mean, he had a pretty bad stroke. And following that, there was a lot of false reports that he had died, and false obituaries had popped up. But then he did pass away in 1940, June 10 of 1940. He had the stroke in January. So he still lived a good 6 months after that initial stroke, but they were still fighting off those fake rumors, fake news that he had died earlier on. But he died on June 10, 1940. His remains were returned to Jamaica, where he basically received a hero's welcome. He was interred, and a number of years later, in 1964, his body was moved to where it is now. So, very interesting. A man who had lived a very interesting and very important life.
It was interesting kind of looking at some of the people that were really seeking to get his pardon. That there were people who wanted to reclaim the status of Marcus Garvey so that he wouldn't be known as a criminal or a convict or something of that nature. And one of the people who was advocating for the pardon and speaking with President Biden, the quote was this: "We are the beneficiaries of Marcus Garvey's vision because he clarified for us the question of our identity." And there's a lot to be said for that, because they wanted to make sure that the community knew that Marcus Garvey, the whole Black Star Line, the irregularities, the criminal conviction, is a stain that is on Marcus Garvey, but it's a stain on an otherwise good man who tried his best to secure value, dignity, and ultimately life for his culture, for his people. And there is some respect for that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A man who was determined to recapture culture and identity for his people. Chris, this was a great episode. I really enjoyed looking into Marcus Garvey a lot more than I've ever looked into him before, I think. Like I said, when you teach American history too, we do cover Marcus Garvey. At least I guess you talk about him too in your class.
Absolutely.
So getting a chance to sort of focus in a little more than what you can do in a survey class is always very interesting. Well, listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please be sure to share this episode with your family and friends. We're available, of course, on Spotify, on Anchor, and also on YouTube. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
Talk to you later.